The penthouse office of Vance Global was suspended above the city like a glass throne, a fitting domain for a man who ruled over a financial empire. Declan Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his tailored suit perfectly aligned with the rigid, uncompromising posture he carried through life. He checked his luxury watch, his jaw clenching as his closest friend and chief legal counsel, Liam Mercer, paced behind him. The merger with the traditionalist European conglomerate was slipping through their fingers. The foreign CEO had made it abundantly clear that he did not trust his legacy to a notorious bachelor known for reckless social escapades. He wanted a family man, someone grounded. Declan had 2 weeks to produce a respectable, serious fiancé, or the deal of a lifetime would collapse. And waiting in the wings was Arthur Penhaligon, a senior board member who was secretly gathering the votes to oust Declan the moment the merger failed. Declan turned from the window, his voice laced with the cold authority that terrified his rivals. "Find someone, Liam. Draw up an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a lucrative payout. I do not care who she is, as long as she can wear a ring, smile for the cameras, and keep her mouth shut. I will not let Arthur take my father's company from me over some archaic family values clause." Liam sighed, tossing a file onto the massive mahogany desk. "It is not that simple, Declan. The press dissects every woman you associate with. If we hire an actress or a socialite, the European board will see right through the facade. You need someone invisible, someone with no digital footprint of scandals, someone normal." The conversation was interrupted by the soft hum of the private elevator. The heavy oak doors pushed open, but it was not a late-night executive. It was a young woman pushing a supply cart, wearing the simple grey uniform of the night-cleaning crew. Clara Thorne froze, her hands gripping the handle of the cart. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot, and though she wore an oversized uniform, there was an unmistakable, sharp intelligence in her quiet gaze. She was not supposed to be on the executive floor this early in the evening, a scheduling error she realized too late. Declan stared at her, an idea sparking in his ruthless mind. She was exactly what Liam had described: invisible, normal, desperate enough to take a check. He walked toward her, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the marble floor. He did not ask for her name. He simply pulled a customized checkbook from his jacket pocket and clicked his silver pen. "I need a favor," he said, his tone entirely transactional. "Actually, I need a wife for 6 months. I will pay you $1 million. You will live in my penthouse, attend 3 galas and smile at a few dinners. When it is over, you walk away rich. Sign this, and the money is yours." He extended the check toward her, fully expecting her to gasp, to tremble, to thank him profusely. Instead, Clara looked at the piece of paper, then up at his arrogant face. She did not flinch. She did not reach for the money. "Keep your money, Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice steady and surprisingly refined. "I am here to clean the floors, not your reputation. If you want someone to buy, I suggest you try a luxury car dealership. They have fewer objections." She turned her cart around, the wheels squeaking slightly in the heavy silence of the office, and walked back toward the elevator without a backward glance. Declan stood completely still, the check fluttering slightly in his hand. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever walked away from his money. He felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of intrigue. Liam chuckled softly from the leather sofa. "Well, I think you found her. The only problem is, she is the only woman in the city who does not want you." Over the next 3 days, Declan could not get the defiant cleaning woman out of his head. He had his security team pull her file. Clara Thorne lived in a tiny apartment on the edge of the city, worked 2 jobs, no debt but barely making rent, yet there was a gap in her background, a 5-year period where her records were almost entirely blank, save for a few mundane tax returns. Declan did not care about the gap. He cared about the fact that she had rejected him. He needed her for the merger, but more than that, his pride demanded he win. He waited for her in the underground parking garage after her shift. Clara emerged, exhausted, her shoulders slumped under a worn jacket. When she saw him leaning against his sleek black town car, she let out a long, weary sigh. "Are you here to offer me $2 million? Or are you going to fire me for bruised ego?" she asked, not breaking her stride. Declan pushed himself off the car, stepping in front of her. Neither. I am here to negotiate. Why did you refuse? You need the money. My investigators told me you are facing an eviction notice next month. Clara stopped, her eyes narrowing with a flash of fierce pride. Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Do not ever dig into my life again. You think because you sit in a glass tower you can just reach down and rearrange people like chess pieces. I do not want your money because money like yours always comes with a collar. I would rather be evicted than owned. There was a raw, bruising honesty in her words that caught Declan off guard. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant facade slipped, replaced by genuine surprise. He looked at her not as an employee but as an equal opponent. I do not want to own you, Clara, he said, his voice dropping to a quieter, more even timbre. I am backed into a corner. If I do not present a stable, married life to a group of investors by the end of the month, a man who despises my family will dismantle the company my father built. It is a business contract. Mutually assured survival. You get the funds to secure your independence permanently, and I get to keep my legacy. We do not even have to like each other. Clara studied his face. She saw the desperation he was trying so hard to hide beneath his tailored suit. She thought of the eviction notice, and of a secret she had buried deep in her past, a life of wealth and betrayal she had run away from. The money would allow her to finally disappear for good, to buy a new identity where her old family could never find her. 6 months, she said quietly. No physical intimacy. I get my own room, my own schedule when we are not on display, and I want the money transferred to an offshore account of my choosing. Declan nodded, feeling an unfamiliar sense of relief. Agreed. The wedding was a masterpiece of corporate theater. It took place in a historic courthouse, followed by a heavily photographed reception at the most exclusive hotel in the city. Clara wore a breathtaking silk gown that Declan had ordered from Paris, though she moved in it with a stiff, uncomfortable grace. She hated the flashing cameras, the whispers of the elite crowd who could not fathom where Declan Vance had found this unknown, strikingly beautiful woman. As they stood near the grand staircase posing for the society pages, Declan placed his hand on the small of her back. She flinched slightly, her body rigid. Relax, he murmured, keeping his smile fixed for the cameras. You look like you are walking to the gallows. I feel like I am, she replied through gritted teeth, holding a champagne flute she had not sipped. These people are vultures. They are just waiting to see me fail. Let them wait, he said, his grip on her waist tightening just a fraction in a surprisingly protective gesture. You are a Vance now. You do not bow to them. Across the ballroom, standing in the shadows of a massive floral arrangement, Arthur Penhaligon watched the newlyweds with calculating eyes. The grey-haired board member swirled his scotch, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He knew Declan too well. This sudden marriage was a desperate maneuver to save the European merger. Arthur beckoned his assistant over, not taking his eyes off Clara. Look into her, Arthur whispered harshly. Every shadow, every whisper. I want to know where he found her. No one is this clean. Find her dirt, and I will use it to bury them both. The first week in the penthouse was a study in cold, polite avoidance. The luxury apartment was vast enough that they rarely crossed paths. Clara spent her days reading in the library, actively ignoring the opulence around her. She refused to use the personal chef, preferring to make her own toast and coffee in the sprawling, spotless kitchen. This small act of rebellion inexplicably irritated Declan. One rainy evening he came home late, exhausted from a grueling board meeting where Arthur had challenged him at every turn. He found Clara standing barefoot in the kitchen, wearing a simple cotton sweater, struggling to open a stubborn jar of preserves. She looked so entirely out of place among the imported marble and chrome, yet she brought a strange warmth to the usually sterile penthouse. He walked up behind her and silently took the jar from her hands. His large hands gripped the glass, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he broke the seal with a sharp pop. He set it down on the counter and looked at her. You can ask the staff to do that, you know, he said, his voice rough with fatigue. I do not need servants to feed me, she replied, taking the jar back. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I have done it my whole life. He leaned against the counter, watching her spread the jam on a burnt piece of toast. "Why do you hate this so much?" he asked suddenly. "Most people would kill to live like this, to never worry about a bill again." Clara paused, her knife hovering over the bread. "Because wealth is just a gilded cage. It makes people cruel. It makes them believe they are untouchable." She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You think this penthouse protects you from the world, Declan, but all it does is isolate you from anything real." He wanted to argue with her, to remind her of the power he wielded, but the words died in his throat. In all his life, surrounded by sycophants and corporate sharks, no one had ever looked at him with such piercing honesty. For the first time, Declan Vance realized that the woman he had hired to play a part might be the only real thing in his life. The days bled into weeks, and the penthouse became a battleground of quiet glances and unspoken tension. The European merger was inching closer to finalization, which meant Declan and Clara were forced to attend a grueling gauntlet of high society events. At a charity gala honoring the city's top financial minds, Clara found herself surrounded by the very world she had sworn to leave behind. She wore a deep emerald gown, standing by Declan's side as he navigated the shark-infested waters of corporate politics. He kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, a constant grounding presence amidst the flashing cameras and veiled insults of the elite. When Arthur Penhaligon approached them, his smile was as sharp as a razor. He complimented Clara with a mock bow, his eyes scanning her for any sign of weakness. Declan immediately shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of Clara, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning as he told Arthur to enjoy the champagne and keep his distance. It was the first time Clara realized Declan was not just controlling the narrative, he was actively protecting her. That night after the gala, the exhaustion finally caught up with Declan. Clara found him in the dimly lit library, his jacket discarded, rubbing his temples as a brutal migraine took hold. Instead of walking away to her separate bedroom, she quietly went to the kitchen and brewed a strong, dark tea with a specific blend of herbs. She set the mug on his desk without a word, pulling the heavy curtains shut to block out the glaring city lights. Declan looked up, the harsh lines of his face softening in the shadows. He did not say thank you, but his hand brushed against hers as he took the warm mug, his thumb lingering on her knuckles for a second longer than necessary. It was a silent truce, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of their business arrangement. But the fragile peace shattered 3 days later. The air in the penthouse was suffocatingly thick when Clara walked into the study to find Declan standing by his desk, a manila folder thrown open across the polished wood. His eyes were dark, a storm of fury and betrayal brewing in his gaze. He looked at her, his voice deadly quiet as he spoke her full name. Clara Aldridge. The name struck her like a physical blow. She froze in the doorway, the blood draining from her face. Declan paced the room, his voice rising with every step as he laid out the truth. He had run a secondary, deeper background check after Arthur started asking questions. He discovered that the humble cleaning woman he had hired was the sole heir to the Aldridge shipping empire, a company that had collapsed in a spectacular wave of corruption and scandal 5 years ago. Clara had renounced her trust fund, changed her last name to her mother's maiden name, and disappeared into the working class to escape the toxic legacy of her father. "You lied to me," Declan said, his fists clenched at his sides. "You sat in my kitchen and lectured me about the cruelty of wealth while you grew up with a silver spoon in your mouth. You are a liability. If Arthur leaks this to the European board, the merger is dead." Clara did not back down. She stepped fully into the room, her voice trembling but fierce. "I did not lie to you to ruin your precious deal, Declan. I walked away from that name because it was soaked in blood and greed. My father destroyed lives for profit, just like the people you shake hands with every day. I chose to scrub floors rather than live on dirty money. You bought a wife for $1 million, Mr. Vance. You do not get to judge my morality." The truth hung between them, painful and raw. The walls they had built were crumbling, exposing the deep wounds they both carried. For the next week, the penthouse was a tomb. They communicated only through Liam, coordinating their public appearances with icy professionalism. Declan threw himself into the merger negotiations, working late into the night to avoid the heavy silence of his own home. Yet, despite the anger, he could not stop thinking about the fierce pride in her eyes when she defended her choices. One morning, Clara woke to find a small unmarked envelope resting against her coffee mug on the kitchen counter. Inside was a single document, legally sealing the offshore account he had promised her, fully funded 3 months early. There was no note, no grand apology, just a silent, definitive proof that he kept his word and that he recognized her need for true independence. It was a gesture of respect that broke through the ice around her heart, but their quiet understanding was violently interrupted on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara was alone in the penthouse when the private elevator chimed. It was not Declan. Arthur Penhaligon stepped into the foyer, his face twisted into a triumphant sneer. He did not come alone. 2 imposing security guards stood by the doors. Arthur tossed a thick dossier onto the glass coffee table. He knew everything. Not just her real name, but the exact terms of the $1 million contract Declan had signed. He had paid off a paralegal in Liam's office to steal the encrypted file. Arthur smiled, pouring himself a drink from Declan's bar without asking. "The game is over, my dear," Arthur said smoothly. "Tomorrow morning I am handing this file to the European CEO and the press. Declan will be ruined, completely disgraced, and I will take my rightful place as the head of Vance Global. Unless, of course, you leave him tonight. Disappear back into the gutter where you belong, and I might just let him keep his pride." Clara stood alone, staring at the man who was about to destroy the only person who had ever truly seen her. Clara did not tremble. She looked at the dossier on the glass table, then up at Arthur Penhaligon, whose smug smile suggested he had already won. She had spent 5 years running from men exactly like him, men who used leverage and fear to build their empires. But as she stood in the penthouse, she realized she was done running. She walked over to the table, picked up the heavy file, and dropped it straight into the burning fireplace. Arthur lunged forward, his face twisting in sudden outrage, but the flames had already caught the thick paper. He screamed that he had digital copies, that she was making a fatal mistake. But Clara simply pointed to the discreet black dome on the ceiling. It was the penthouse security system, which recorded both audio and high-definition video directly to Declan's private encrypted server. She told Arthur that if he released his copies, she would release the footage of him breaking into a private residence and blackmailing a board member's wife. Arthur stormed out, his threats echoing in the empty foyer, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. The next morning, the boardroom of Vance Global was suffocatingly tense. The European chief executive sat at the head of the long oak table, his pen hovering over the final merger documents. Declan sat opposite him, exhausted but resolute, bracing himself for Arthur's inevitable attack. Right on cue, Arthur stood up, clearing his throat loudly, a secondary manila folder in his hands. He began to speak of integrity, of corporate honesty, preparing to deliver the final blow to Declan's career. But before he could open the folder, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Clara walked in, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that commanded the room. She did not look like a nervous bride, she looked like an equal. She walked straight to the European executive and placed a small silver flash drive on the table in front of him. She explained with chilling calm that the drive contained footage of Arthur Penhaligon attempting to extort her and admitting to corporate espionage to sabotage the merger. The room erupted into chaos, but Declan's eyes never left Clara. He watched as the European executive plugged the drive into his tablet, listened to the clear audio, and slowly turned his furious gaze toward Arthur. The downfall was swift and absolute. The foreign executive declared that he would never do business with a company harboring a snake like Penhaligon. In a matter of minutes, Arthur was stripped of his board seat, his security badge was confiscated, and he was escorted out of the building by his own guards, his reputation permanently destroyed. The merger was signed, but for the first time in his life, Declan did not care about the ink on the paper. He only cared about the woman standing quietly by the window. When the boardroom finally emptied, Declan and Clara were left alone in the heavy silence. He walked over to her, his heart hammering against his ribs, in a way it never had during a multi-million-dollar negotiation. He pulled the original marriage contract from his inner jacket pocket, the document that had bound them together in a lie. Slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half, then into pieces, letting the paper fall to the floor. Clara watched him, her breath catching in her throat. She asked him what he was doing. Declan stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He told her that he was done with contracts, done with arrangements, and done with hiding behind a fortress of wealth. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. He confessed that she was the only real thing in his life, that she had forced him to see the man he could be, and that he did not want to spend another day without her truly by his side. Clara looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he had finally surrendered, and leaned into his touch, her own tears of relief falling silently. A year later, the city skyline looked entirely different to Clara. She was no longer hiding in the shadows of the working class, nor was she a prisoner in a gilded cage. She stood in the bright, open lobby of her own non-profit foundation, a firm dedicated to providing housing and legal aid to families displaced by corporate greed. Declan stood beside her, holding her hand tightly, his proud gaze fixed on her as she cut the ribbon for the grand opening. They had built a life on truth, leaving the ghosts of their pasts behind. Their love had started as a desperate gamble, a cold transaction in a glass tower, but it had grown into an unbreakable partnership. And as Declan pulled her into a warm, lingering kiss while the crowd applauded, Clara knew that true wealth had nothing to do with money. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. See you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents Declan and Clara's story as more than a romance. It shows how their relationship becomes a study of power, dignity, identity, trust, and the emotional consequences of wealth. At the beginning, Declan Vance sees life through the logic of business. When his company is threatened by a failed merger, he believes the solution is simple. He can hire a woman to become his wife, create the appearance of stability, and protect the legacy his father left behind. His offer to Clara reveals his greatest psychological weakness. He is accustomed to solving problems with money and control, so he initially treats a human relationship like another corporate transaction. Clara immediately challenges this worldview. Although she is struggling financially and facing eviction, she refuses to accept the first offer because she values dignity more than comfort. Her reaction represents one of the central lessons of the story. Financial power can create opportunities, but it cannot automatically create respect. Clara establishes boundaries and forces Declan to recognize that she is not an object he can purchase. When she eventually accepts the arrangement, she does so only after negotiating conditions that protect her independence. This begins to change the balance of power between them. The infographic also emphasizes the contrast between social classes. Declan lives in a luxurious penthouse surrounded by executives, expensive events, and powerful investors, while Clara has been surviving through ordinary work and financial uncertainty. Yet the story slowly reverses the assumptions associated with those positions. Declan has wealth but lives emotionally isolated. Clara has little money but possesses independence, moral clarity, and the courage to challenge powerful people. Their different social positions reveal that status and personal strength are not the same thing. Their relationship develops through trust rather than attraction alone. At first, everything between them is controlled by a contract. They perform marriage in public while keeping emotional distance in private. Gradually, small moments of care begin to weaken those barriers. Declan becomes protective of Clara when Arthur threatens her, while Clara shows compassion when Declan is exhausted and vulnerable. These moments demonstrate how genuine intimacy develops through consistency, safety, and emotional openness rather than through wealth or appearances. Clara's hidden identity adds another psychological layer. Her rejection of wealth is not based on ignorance of privilege. She was born into a powerful family and deliberately abandoned that world after witnessing the corruption connected to her father's empire. Her past explains why she associates money with control and moral compromise. Declan also carries the burden of family legacy, but instead of escaping it, he has built his identity around protecting it. Their conflict therefore reflects two different responses to inherited pressure. Clara runs from a corrupt legacy, while Declan fights desperately to preserve his own. Arthur represents the darkest side of ambition. He uses espionage, manipulation, blackmail, and humiliation because he sees people only as tools in a struggle for power. His behavior contrasts with the emotional transformation occurring between Declan and Clara. When Clara refuses to surrender to Arthur and exposes his actions, she proves that moral courage can challenge institutional power. The boardroom confrontation becomes the turning point where truth finally becomes stronger than manipulation. The symbols shown in the infographic reinforce this transformation. The penthouse represents wealth but also isolation. The marriage contract represents control without emotional intimacy. The fireplace, where Clara destroys Arthur's dossier, represents her decision to stop living in fear. The non-profit foundation at the end represents healing and a new understanding of wealth as something that can serve people rather than dominate them. By the end of the story, Declan tearing apart the marriage contract symbolizes the destruction of the relationship they originally created. What began as a calculated arrangement becomes a voluntary partnership. Clara no longer needs to hide, and Declan no longer relies on money as his primary source of security. Their journey suggests that real wealth is measured not by status, property, or corporate success, but by integrity, purpose, mutual respect, and the freedom to choose a relationship built on truth.